Spear and Fang by Robert E. Howard. Ah crouched close to the cave mouth, watching Garnor with wondering eyes. Garnor's occupation interested her, as well as Garnor himself. As for Garnor, he was too occupied with his work to notice her. A torch stuck in a niche in the cave wall dimly illuminated the roomy cavern, and by its light Garnor was laboriously tracing figures on the wall. With a piece of flint, he scratched the outline, and then, with a twig dipped in ochre paint, completed the figure. The result was crude, but gave evidence of real artistic genius, struggling for expression. It was a mammoth that he sought to depict, and little Ah-Iah's eyes widened with wonder and admiration. Wonderful! What though the beast lacked a hind leg and no tail? It was tribesmen, just struggling out of utter barbarism, who were the critics, and to them Garnor was a past master. However, it was not to watch the reproduction of a mammoth that Ah-Iah hid among the scanty bushes by Garnor's cave. The admiration for the painting paled beside the look of positive adoration with which she favored the artist. Indeed, Garnor was not unpleasing to the eye. Tall he was, towering well above 6 feet, leanly built, with mighty shoulders and narrow hips, the build of a fighting man. Both his hands and his feet were long and slim, and his features, thrown into bold profile by the flickering torchlight, were intelligent, with a high, broad forehead, topped by a mane of sandy hair. Ah-Iah herself was very easy to look upon. Her hair, as well as her eyes, was black and fell about her slim shoulders in a rippling wave. No ochre tattooing tinted her cheek, for she was still unmated. Both the girl and the youth were perfect specimens of the great Cro-Magnon race, which came from no man knows where, and announced and enforced their supremacy over beast and beast-man. Ah-Iah glanced about nervously. All ideas to the contrary, customs and taboos, are much more narrow and vigorously enforced among savage peoples. The more primitive a race, the more intolerant their customs. Vice and licentiousness may be the rule, but the appearance of vice is shunned and condemned. So, if Ah-Iah had been discovered hiding near the cave of an unattached young man, denunciation as a shameless woman would have been her lot, and, doubtless, a public whipping. To be proper, Ah-Iah should have played the modest, demure maiden, perhaps skillfully arousing the young artist's interest without seeming to do so. Then, if the youth was pleased, would have followed public wooing by means of crude love songs and music from reed pipes, then barter with her parents, and then marriage, or no wooing at all if the lover was wealthy. But little Ah-Iah was herself a mark of progress. Covert glances had failed to attract the attention of the young man, who seemed engrossed with his artistry, so she had taken to the unconventional way of spying upon him in hopes of finding some way to win him. Garnor turned from his completed work, stretched, and glanced toward the cave mouth. Like a frightened rabbit, little Ah-Iah ducked and darted away. When Garnor emerged from the cave, he was puzzled by the sight of a small, slender footprint in the soft loam outside the cave. Ah-Iah walked primly toward her own cave, which was, with most of the others, at some distance from Garnor's cave. As she did so, she noticed a group of warriors talking excitedly in front of the chief's cave. A mere girl might not intrude upon the counsels of men, but such was Ia's curiosity that she dared a scolding by slipping nearer. She heard the words footprint and gur-na, man-ape. The footprints of a gur-na had been found in the forest not far from the caves. Gur-na was a word of hatred and horror to the people of the caves, for creatures whom the tribesmen called gur-na, or man-apes, were the hairy monsters of another age, the brutish men of the Neanderthal. More feared than mammoth or tiger, they had ruled the forests until the Cro-Magnon men had come and waged savage warfare against them. Of mighty power and little mind, savage, bestial, and cannibalistic, they inspired the tribesmen with loathing and horror, a horror transmitted through the ages in tales of ogres and goblins, of werewolves and beast men. They were fewer and more cunning now. No longer they rushed roaring into battle, but cunning and frightful, they slunk about the forests, the terror of all beasts, brooding in their brutish minds with a hatred for the men who had driven them from the best hunting grounds. And ever the Cro-Magnon men trailed them down and slaughtered them, until suddenly they had withdrawn far into the deep forests. But the fear of them remained with the tribesmen, and no woman went into the jungle alone. Sometimes the children went, and sometimes they returned not, and searchers found but signs of a ghastly feast, with tracks that were not the tracks of beast, nor yet the tracks of men. And so a hunting party would go forth and hunt the monster down. Sometimes it gave battle and was slain, and sometimes it fled before them and escaped into the depths of the forest, where they dared not follow. Once, a hunting party, reckless with the chase, had pursued a fleeing gur-na into the deep forest, and there, in a deep ravine, where overhanging limbs shut out the sunlight, numbers of the Neanderthalers had come upon them. So no more entered the forests. Ia turned away with a glance at the forest. Somewhere in its depths lurked the beast man, piggish eyes, glinting crafty hate, malevolent, frightful. Someone stepped across her path. It was Ka-Nanu, the son of a counselor of the chief. She drew away with a shrug of her shoulders. She did not like Ka-Nanu, and she was afraid of him. He wooed her with a mocking air, as if he did it merely for amusement, and would take her whenever he wished anyway. He seized her by the wrist. "Turn not away, fair maiden," said he. "It is your slave, Ka-Nanu." "Let me go," she answered. "I must go to the spring for water." "Then I will go with you, moon of delight, so that no beast may harm you." And accompany her he did, in spite of her protests. "There is a gur-na abroad," he told her sternly. "It is lawful for a man to accompany even an unmated maiden for protection, and I am Ka-Nanu," he added in a different tone. "Do not resist me too far, or I will teach you obedience." Ia knew somewhat of the man's ruthless nature. Many of the tribal girls looked with favor on Ka-Nanu, for he was bigger and taller even than Ga-Nor, and more handsome in a reckless, cruel way. But Ia loved Ga-Nor, and she was afraid of Ka-Nanu. Her very fear of him kept her from resisting his approaches too much. Ga-Nor was known to be gentle with women, if careless of them, while Ka-Nanu, thereby showing himself to be another mark of progress, was proud of his success with women and used his power over them in no gentle fashion. Ia found Ka-Nanu, was to be feared more than a beast, for at the spring, just out of sight of the caves, he seized her in his arms. "Ah, yeah," he whispered, "my little antelope, I have you at last. You shall not escape me." In vain she struggled and pleaded with him. Lifting her in his mighty arms, he strode away into the forest. Frantically she strove to escape, to dissuade him. "I am not powerful enough to resist you," she said, "but I will accuse you before the tribe." "You will never accuse me, little antelope," he said, and she read another, even more sinister intention in his cruel countenance. On and on into the forest he carried her. In the midst of a glade he paused, his hunter's instinct alert. From the trees in front of them dropped a hideous monster, a hairy, misshapen, frightful thing. Ah-Iah's scream re-echoed through the forest as the thing approached. Ka-Nanu, white-lipped and horrified, dropped Ah-Iah to the ground and told her to run. Then, drawing knife and axe, he advanced. The Neanderthal man plunged forward, on short, gnarled legs. He was covered with hair, and his features were more hideous than an ape's because of the grotesque quality of the man in them. Flat, flaring nostrils, retreating chin, fangs, no forehead whatever, great, immensely long arms, dangling from sloping, incredible shoulders, the monster seemed like the devil himself to the terrified girl. His ape-like head came scarcely to Ka-Nanu's shoulders, yet he must have outweighed the warrior by nearly 100 pounds. On he came like a charging buffalo, and Ka-Nanu met him squarely and boldly. With flint axe and obsidian dagger, he thrust and smote, but the axe was brushed aside like a toy, and the arm that held the knife snapped like a stick in the misshapen hand of the Neanderthaler. The girl saw the counselor's son wrenched from the ground and swung into the air, saw him hurled clear across the glade, saw the monster leap after him and rend him limb from limb. Then the Neanderthaler turned his attention to her. A new expression came into his hideous eyes as he lumbered toward her, his great hairy hands, horridly smeared with blood, reaching toward her. Unable to flee, she lay, dizzy with horror and fear, and the monster dragged her to him, leering into her eyes. He swung her over his shoulder and waddled away through the trees, and the girl, half fainting, knew that he was taking her to his lair, where no man would dare come to rescue her. Ga-Nor had come down to the spring to drink. Idly he noticed the faint footprints of a couple who had come before him. Idly he noticed that they had not returned. Each footprint had its individual characteristic. That of the man he knew to be Ka-Nanu. The other track was the same as that in front of his cave. He wondered, idly, as Ga-Nor was wont to do all things except the painting of pictures. Then, at the spring, he noticed that the footprints of the girl ceased, but that the man's turned toward the jungle and were more deeply imprinted than before. Therefore, Ka-Nanu was carrying the girl. Ga-Nor was no fool. He knew that a man carries a girl into the forest for no good purpose. If she had been willing to go, she would not have been carried. Now, Ga-Nor, another mark of progress, was inclining to meddle in things not pertaining to him. Perhaps another man would have shrugged his shoulders and gone his way, reflecting that it would not be well to interfere with the son of a counselor. But Ga-Nor had few interests, and once his interest was roused, he was inclined to see a thing through. Moreover, though not a renowned fighter, he feared no man. Therefore, He loosened axe and dagger in his belt, shifted his grip upon his spear, and took up the trail. On and on, deeper and deeper into the forest, the Neanderthaler carried little Ah-Ya. The forest was silent and evil. No birds, no insects broke the stillness. Through the overhanging trees, no sunlight filtered. On padded feet that made no noise, the Neanderthaler hurried on. Beasts slunk out of his path. Once, a great python came slithering through the jungle, and the Neanderthaler took to the trees with surprising speed for one of his gigantic bulk. He was not at home in the trees, however, not even as much as Ah-Ya would have been. Once or twice the girl glimpsed another such monster as her captor. Evidently, they had gone far beyond the vaguely defined boundaries of her race. The other Neanderthal men avoided them. It was evident that they lived as beasts do, uniting only against some common enemy, and not often then. Therein had lain the reason for the success of the Cro-Magnon's warfare against them. Into a ravine he carried the girl, and into a cave, small and vaguely illumined by the light from without. He threw her roughly to the floor of the cave, where she lay, too terrified to rise. The monster watched her, like some demon of the forest. He did not even jabber at her, as an ape would have done. The Neanderthalers had no form of speech whatever. He offered her meat of some kind, uncooked, of course. Her mind reeling with horror, she saw that it was the arm of a Cro-Magnon child. When he saw she would not eat, he devoured it himself, tearing the flesh with great fangs. He took her between his great hands, bruising her soft flesh. He ran rough fingers through her hair, and when he saw that he hurt her, he seemed filled with a fiendish glee. He tore out handfuls of her hair, seeming to enjoy devilishly the torturing of his fair captive. Ah-Ya set her teeth, and would not scream as she had done at first, and presently he desisted. The leopard skin garment she wore seemed to enrage him. The leopard was his hereditary foe. He plucked it from her and tore it to pieces. And meanwhile, Gar-Nor was hurrying through the forest. He was racing now, and his face was a devil's mask, for he had come upon the bloody glade and found the monster's tracks leading away from it. And in the cave, in the ravine, the Neanderthaler reached for Ah-Ya. She sprang back, and he plunged toward her. He had her in a corner, but she slipped under his arm and sprang away. He was still between her and the outside of the cave. Unless she could get past him, he would corner her and seize her. So she pretended to spring to one side. The Neanderthaler lumbered in that direction, and, quick as a cat, she sprang the other way and darted past him, out into the ravine. With a bellow, he charged after her. A stone rolled beneath her foot, flinging her headlong. Before she could rise, his hand seized her shoulder. As he dragged her into the cave, she screamed, wildly, frenziedly, with no hope of rescue, just the scream of a woman in the grasp of a beast. Gar-Nor heard that scream as he bounded down into the ravine. He approached the cave swiftly but cautiously. As he looked in, he saw red rage. In the vague light of the cave, the great Neanderthaler stood, his piggish eyes on his foe, hideous, hairy, blood-smeared, while at his feet, her soft white body contrasting with the shaggy monster, her long hair gripped in his blood-stained hand, lay Ah-Ya. The Neanderthaler bellowed, dropping his captive, and charged. And Gar-Nor met him, not matching brute strength with his lesser might, but leaping back and out of the cave. His spear leapt, and the monster bellowed as it tore through his arm. Leaping back again, the warrior jerked his spear and crouched. Again the Neanderthaler rushed, and again the warrior leaped away and thrust, this time for the great hairy chest. And so they battled, speed and intelligence against brute strength and savagery. Once the great lashing arm of the monster caught Gar-Nor upon the shoulder and hurled him a dozen feet away, rendering that arm nearly useless for a time. The Neanderthaler bounded after him, but Gar-Nor flung himself to one side and leaped to his feet. Again and again his spear drew blood, but apparently it seemed only to enrage the monster. Then, before the warrior knew it, the wall of the ravine was at his back, and he heard Ah-Ia shriek as the monster rushed in. The spear was torn from his hand, and he was in the grasp of his foe. The great arms encircled his neck and shoulders. The great fangs sought his throat. He thrust his elbow under the retreating chin of his antagonist, and with his free hand struck the hideous face again and again. Blows that would have felled an ordinary man, but which the Neanderthal beast did not even notice. Gar-Nor felt consciousness going from him. The terrific arms were crushing him, threatening to break his neck. Over the shoulder of his foe, he saw the girl approaching with a great stone, and he tried to motion her back. With a great effort, he reached down over the monster's arm and found his axe, but so close were they clinched together that he could not draw it. The Neanderthal man set himself to break his foe to pieces as one breaks a stick. But Gar-Nor's elbow was thrust under his chin, and the more the Neanderthal man tugged, the deeper drove the elbow into his hairy throat. Presently, he realized that fact and flung Gar-Nor away from him. As he did so, the warrior drew his axe and, striking with the fury of desperation, clove the monster's head. For a minute, Gar-Nor stood reeling above his foe. Then he felt a soft form within his arms and saw a pretty face close to his. "Gar-Nor," Aia whispered, and Gar-Nor gathered the girl in his arms. "What I have fought for, I will keep," said he. And so it was that the girl who went forth into the forest in the arms of an abductor came back in the arms of a lover and a mate. Hello everyone. I hope you enjoyed that reading of Spear and Fang by Robert E. Howard. This story was one of Howard's first stories, which was published in Weird Tales, and it was also one of the first stories which Howard published at all. I believe by this point, this story was published in 1925, and I believe by this point, Howard had published some amateur pieces of fiction and poetry, I believe in a high school newspaper and some local journals. But this was one of his first stories that was published in a real magazine, being Weird Tales. Now, a little while ago, last year, I did an analysis of Robert E. Howard's writing style using data analysis. And to do that, I went back and cataloged all of Howard's stories. And in my notes, I have Spear and Fang being published in 1925, but being written in 1924. And when I'm looking at my notes, the only definite story that I have earlier than Spear and Fang is a story called Golden Hope Christmas, which I think was a Western, and I believe it was published in high school newspaper or a college newspaper. So we could consider Spear and Fang to be Howard's first published story for a commercial magazine. This story is also significant in another way. Not only is it one of Howard's first published stories, but it's the first story that includes a great ape or a man ape, or in this case, a Neanderthal, as a villain. And if you know anything about Howard's other stories, this will be a reoccurring villain character or type of villain character in his stories throughout his entire career. So, of the other stories which feature man-ape characters or ape characters who are villains, probably Rogues in the House is the best well-known one because it's a Conan story. In this story, we see Conan go up against a man-ape character who's a villain. But apes also feature, I believe, in The Gods of Balsagoth, there is an ape character who shows up towards the end and tries to kill one of the characters. And I think also in The Hour of the Dragon, Conan, which is also a Conan story or novella, I think Conan fights a giant gorilla in that story. There are probably a few other stories that I'm missing, but these man-ape characters are a common occurrence in Howard's stories. It's interesting that these characters have existed from the start. A lot of people discuss the barbarism versus civilization theme that goes on in Howard's stories. This is probably the primary theme which Howard is dealing with in his fiction. But it's interesting that no one talks about the other comparison that is happening. It's not just barbarism versus civilization, but there's also barbarism versus the bestial. And the man-apes, the villains, represent the bestial. So say, for instance, in Rogues in the House, we have Conan, who's the main character, and he is the barbarian character. Then I believe we have him in a civilization setting. He's in a city, I think, which represents the civilized world. But then we also have this primordial bestial villain, which is the ape. So there's almost three levels. It's not just the barbarian versus civilization, it's also the barbarian versus the bestial. In many ways, the barbarian is in the middle. Barbarism is sort of the middle ground between complete animalism, in the case of the ape, and civilization, which we know that Howard doesn't think much of. He prefers the barbarian mentality and worldview. I would say he thinks it's the best worldview in his ideal view, which was probably not very realistic, but it's obvious that he prefers it. So to bring it back to Spear and Fang, this story in particular, this story has a connection to a photo of Robert E. Howard. If you've seen many photos of Robert, you will know that he sometimes dressed up like characters from his stories, like from like westerns, or I believe there's one where he looks like a pirate. He has like a handkerchief on his head, and he has a like curved saber kind of sword. But there is also a photo of Robert with one of his friends, with a guy who he was friends with in the early 1920s, whose name I've forgotten, but I think was also a writer or had some literary ambition. And this photo is pretty funny. I will post it in the video if I remember. It's Howard and his friend in loincloths, so pretty much in their underwear, and his friend has a spear, and they're mock fighting. It may be that Howard in this photo is meant to be the Neanderthal, because I noticed that his friend has a spear, but he has nothing. Howard is just kind of menacing with his hands. It's also funny that his friend is wearing glasses, which naturally you would not have if you were a Cro-Magnon man. But it's one of the more, I think, endearing photos of Howard. It really shows an aspect of his personality that he didn't take himself as seriously as I think a lot of people did think he took himself. He would like mess around with his friends and take stupid photos and have fun doing that kind of stuff. And part of that was like, playing out his fantasies of the stories that he wrote and probably was thinking about. So this particular story, Spear and Fang, is also notable because it's referenced in a TV show called Primal. And this is like an animated TV show. It's not really a cartoon because it's pretty brutal and violent. It was a show made by a guy called Gendy Tartakovsky. I always see his name in connection to the show. I think it was his kind of brainchild or vision. I had heard about this show just in a general sense. I didn't know it had anything to do with Robert E. Howard. I just heard that it was a great show. It's pretty interesting because there's no dialogue at all in the show. Everything is told through the characters' facial expressions and body language, but there is very definitely a plot in all of the episodes. The exact reference to Spear and Fang in the show Primal is the two main characters. So the two main characters in the show, one is a caveman who is called Spear, and he kind of has a pet dinosaur or a sidekick who is called Fang. And for reasons that I will explain, this is obviously a reference to this story, Spear and Fang. So the concept of the show is really that these two main characters get into a bunch of adventures together, often really brutal and violent and bloody adventures. When I started watching this show, Primal, I immediately recognized one of Robert E. Howard's stories was being used as the inspiration for a plot of one of the episodes. I can't remember what episode it was, and I believe the story which they were using was Wings in the Night, which I think was a Solomon Kane story. Anyway, but the more I looked into it, the more I realized that this entire show is sort of based on, if not the mythology in Howard's stories, but just the general vibe. It sort of takes a lot of the themes from Howard's stories and the characters and archetypes, maybe would be a better word to describe it. For instance, in Howard's stories, winged men show up a lot. So these are men who are often sort of bestial in nature and who have wings. So they are in Almuric, they're in the Garden of Fear, another story, and they're also in Wings in the Night. They're probably in other ones as well. They may be in Queen of the Black Coast. Anyway, Robert really likes these characters in his stories, so he brings them back again and again as villains. And this TV show, Spear and Fang, uses these characters as well. This was the episode that I watched when I realized that the episodes are often direct references to Robert E. Howard's work. Obviously, this guy, Gendy Tartakovsky, is a big fan of Howard and was inspired by his work to make the TV show. It's interesting that this story hasn't been made into an audiobook before now, because I would have thought that the name recognition of this audiobook would have been kind of a no-brainer. You know, almost all of Howard's work has been made into audiobooks by this point, if not by me, by somebody else. There is only about, I think only, in my list, there's only about 10 stories left that haven't been made into audiobooks. These are stories that are in the public domain. There was a lot of stories that Howard wrote that were never published until like 30 years after his death, like in the 1970s. And unfortunately, all of those are not in the public domain, which is a real shame because there's actually some really good stuff in that body of his work. Particularly, like there's a paperback book I got called, it's called Sword Woman, and it features this character called Dark Agnes, who's like a French woman in like the late Middle Ages, I think, or even later than that, maybe the 1600s. Anyway, they're fun stories and it's a really great character, but unfortunately they're not in the public domain. So unless I could buy the copyright or someone else pays for the copyright to make them into an audiobook, they're just not going to be made into an audiobook. At least not a free one that you can get on YouTube. Anyway, but I digress. To get back to Spear and Fang, I was really surprised nobody had done this. It's a pretty short story. And, part of it may be is that it's just not remarkable in terms of Howard's stories. There's many better, more interesting stories. This is by no means a bad story, but I would understand why other people would prefer to do other, more interesting Howard stories before this story. Anyway, that's all my thoughts for this particular story. I hope you enjoyed the reading and stay tuned for more. If you liked it and you want to see more Howard audiobooks, then please like and comment or share the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you really want to support the channel, you can buy this audiobook, or you can now become a Patreon subscriber, which means you give me a bit of money, you get access to all of my audiobooks or most of them, and as well as the music and art which I use in the videos. And overall, it will really help me to make more audiobooks. The financial support I get from any sales of audiobooks actually goes a long way to help me upgrade my gear and learn how to mix audio better as well, and to create better audiobooks. So that's all from me. I hope you have a good day. Bye. If you've enjoyed this content, consider supporting the Eldritch Archives to grow and make more content. Become a supporter on Patreon, buy an audiobook on Bandcamp, or like, comment on, or share one of the videos on YouTube. And as always, thank you for listening.